Christy Badesco? Badesco? Am I saying it wrong?
Sure.
Oh, crap. Come on.
Kevin Cooper. David Cox. For those of you that are muted, if you just press down on your space bar, if you have one, it will unmute you temporarily. Once you let up on the space bar, it will allow you to mute. Leroy Creswell. Bob Day.
Present.
Earl. Frank Golan. Dennis.
Here, they've been drunk.
I see you.
There's the big jug of water right there.
Dr. Ho.
That's a good idea.
I'm here.
Kevin Johnson.
I never seen them since I was in there the other day. I haven't seen them since.
Lisa Krimsky.
Over here.
Andrea Ludu. Gail McGinnis. Rich.
I'm here.
Hey, we have Valerie Paul. Mark Parrott.
Which counted as the confinement shop.
That's not Mitch Roffner. Roffer.
Here.
There we go. Lisa Soto. I see you, Lisa. Megan Stolen.
Here.
Chad Truxell.
I'm here.
Linda Walters.
Here.
Edie Witter. Deborah Woodall. And anybody I didn't call off, you want to identify yourself?
This is Malcolm McFarland.
Marcy Frick with Tetra Tech.
This set flips. University of Florida.
John Windsor.
Tom Fraser.
Jessica Frost, South Florida Water Management District.
Christy Badisco, Stetson.
David Cox, Indian River Soil and Water Conservation District, Audubon, Florida.
Sarah Davis, DEP.
Anyone else?
I see a couple other people, but I can write them down separately. You can go ahead and get the ball rolling.
Okay. So we start with the pledge, and then will you read them the Riot Act?
I will read them the Riot Act. My favorite.
Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
of America, to the republic
For which it holds,
one nation, under
under God,
God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What's wrong, Chuck? You don't want to like go through it with me?
Yeah, no, you're in charge.
That's a scary prospect.
Yeah, that's weird.
Okay, for all of you that just joined us, this meeting is being recorded. The video, the audio, and the chat function. It will be preserved for public record. As we adjust to online meetings, we want to share the following logistical information. All attendees are muted and must be unmuted in order to be heard. For those participating via computer, the raise hand tool is an icon at the bottom of the screen, or it can be found by clicking in the participants box. It'll be next to your name. For those participating via phone, dial *9 and it will allow you to raise your hand. The meeting host will see, can't see the whole thing, sorry, hang on. The meeting host will see a list of everyone who wants to speak and will unmute and call on those individuals one at a time. Attendees will remain muted until specific moments on the agenda when public comment is accepted. Members of the public who wish to give public comment will be unmuted to speak one at a time. To indicate that you want to speak, use the Zoom raise hand tool when the meeting gets to the public comment agenda item. Prior to speaking, all public comment speakers are requested to please state your name and residence and/or affiliation for the official record. Any questions? Okie doke.
Okay, so moving on. So agenda revisions. Do we have anyone who wishes to make a revision to our existing agenda?
Can I interrupt for 1 second? Responding to Beth Powell's comment, we have learned over the past several months using Zoom that if you are having a hard time hearing somebody, it may actually be your internet connection and you may need to pop out and then pop back in and it'll fix itself.
Kevin Johnson has his hand up.
Yeah. Are you guys able to hear me?
We are.
Great. So I was just testing my ability in the dial-in on the phone to be heard because previously in the last meeting I wasn't able to make myself heard. So glad it works. That's all.
All right. Well, we pretty much handled introductions unless somebody else wants to pipe up. All right, we'll move on to approving the minutes from the last meeting. I'm sure you've all read them in detail. Does anyone have any revisions? Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
I move that we accept the minutes.
Whoop, whoop. One of who was first? That's hard to tell.
I don't care. Mitch will go, and I'll move that we approve the minutes as.
Thank you, Mitch.
As received.
And I'll second. It's Chad.
Thank you, Chad. Any discussion? All right. The way we're going to work this is if you do not want to approve the minutes, let us know. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Minutes are approved. Okay, public comment. You raise your hands and Kayleen will find you and pipe you in. Okay. So moving on to the water quality reports. I guess I'm up first. So let me find my bits and pieces. Okay. So I guess if I was, I just got a couple of slides. If I was going to say anything, I'd say that, summer is beginning to take hold. So here are the salinities at 5 of the continuous monitoring sites that the district manages. And you can see where the red arrow pops in sort of in late May or early June, that's, you know, when rainfall really started, and that affected salinities, except in Banana River Lagoon and the Indian River Lagoon near Cocoa, where there's not as much freshwater input. So you're looking at Mosquito Lagoon, Banana River Lagoon is BRL, and Cocoa, that's the Indian River Lagoon. Ogali is a little further south, and then down to Vero in the Indian River Lagoon. Next, please. Water temperatures, you know, have been climbing, so they're up around 30 degrees Celsius or about 86 degrees Fahrenheit now, pretty much everywhere. So the water's definitely getting warmer. And next, thank you. Early in the year, so this, you know, runs from the beginning of this year, 2020, to July. Early in the year, there were some blooms. The Mosquito Lagoon and Banana River Lagoon, and that was Sudanesia was one of the dominants in that. That's the diatom. Then later on in the year here, we've been seeing blooms again in Mosquito and some down near Vero as well. And you'll hear a bit more about the southern blooms when Malcolm speaks during the panel. But this is Pyridinium mostly up in the north, and Sudanesia tends to take over down in the south. Next. Thanks. Dissolved oxygen concentrations have stayed pretty good until sort of about the middle of June, which is on the 20th is where the red arrow is pointing to. Around Cocoa, dissolved oxygen concentrations dropped down to about 1.4 milligrams per liter. And there, around that time in various places, there were some fish kills reported around the 19th, the 22nd, and the 24th of June, running kind of from Merritt Island Causeway through Ogali Causeway. On the 2nd of July, actually, there was a fish kill report up around Titusville, and that may relate to the fact that dissolved oxygen concentrations in that northern IRL part stayed relatively low, not below 2, but relatively low for a fairly long period of time. So if you remember, this is just one spot. And so, you know, you could easily have dissolved oxygen concentration below 2 somewhere nearby. In those, and again, that's mostly the pyridinium likely to drive those blooms. And then the last bit of news came in this morning, which was on the 21st of July from some of the sampling done by the volunteers that work with FWC, that they were seeing nanoplankton near the NASA Causeway in the Indian River Lagoon and at Kelly Park in the Banana River Lagoon. So nanoplankton, and I've tried to check, I haven't gotten a reply, but could well be brown tide. And so, you know, this may be the beginning, as it were. I'm happy to take any questions. Raise your hand and Kayleen will find you.
I'm seeing no one. So Diane?
Diane?
She's unmuting.
Can you hear me now?
Hear you now.
Okay. So greetings, council members. I'm grateful to be back and to see you all. So, next slide. So I prepared this presentation last week, and at last week the lake stage was for Lake Okeechobee was at 12.77 feet. This morning when I checked, it's at 13.01. So with the rainy season that we do have going on, the lake is continuing to slowly rise up, and it doesn't look like we're going to be done with rain anytime soon. So next slide, please. So in this illustration shows the lake inflows and outflows, and any negative numbers indicates that you know, water is flowing back into the lake. So you can see on kind of on the our side of the here near Martin County that we have water flowing back in at 251 CFS back into Lake Okeechobee and from the C10A canal and at 32 CFS back into the canal or into the lake, from the canal into the lake. I have heard some rumblings that some folks are fairly displeased that the water is being sent from our canal into the lake because they feel like the nutrients that it's carrying is helping the bloom within the lake to flourish and get larger. We have not received any Lake Okeechobee discharges since 2019 to the St. Lucie River or Estuary or the Southern Indian River Lagoon. So any problems that we currently have within the estuary and the Southern Indian River Lagoon are really our own, based on our own stormwater runoff that we have within our watershed. Next slide, please. There's just an illustration for the Water Management District on the past 30 days of type of rainfall that we've been having and continue to have. And you can see we're darker in Martin County than we are in some of the other areas of the state where rain is falling. So next slide. And as Chuck talked about, and you know, continue to have the rainy season, our salinities are certainly dropping. It's fair for the oysters in the middle estuary, which this is pretty much this diagram that you see here is the middle estuary, that Speedy Point. But it does get good closer to the inlet. We have fairly good flushing near the inlet, so it's better for the oysters there in the Southern Indian River Lagoon. And you can see when we started to have those rains, how the salinity just continues to be depressed within our area. Next slide. So associated with our stormwater runoff, we typically have within our watershed Enterococcus levels that pop up that the Department of Health monitors on a weekly basis. And you can see here, and Roosevelt Bridge is our mid-estuary. You can see how in early June it was pretty bad for Enterococcus levels, but it finally got good. Probably now, since we're still having rain, we're probably going to see some more reds probably next week. Layton Park is also pretty much the middle estuary. And then the Sand Spit Park and Stewart Sandbar are more in the closer to the inlet area. Then down on the bottom where it says Stewart Causeway, I wanted to include those because those are really the two areas of the Southern Indian River Lagoon. And you can see that in mid-July, we had good levels of Enterococcus, but you know, as we continued to have rains, it got to moderate levels. So that shows that our stormwater runoff is coming through the St. Lucie River and watershed, entering into the intercoastal waterway and actually traveling north, or probably runoff from that area as well, also causing those Enterococcus levels that we're having in the Southern Indian River Lagoon. Next slide, please. Okay, and I know Mark Perry is on. This is one of the first time I looked at my other council reports. I have never pulled in FOS's water quality data before, but I did today. And you can see from the levels how they report and grade the inlet area and the Indian River Lagoon as a B and a C. Now, Mark, I will tell you that at the management board meeting, there was some discussion how FOS, does your scaling. I don't know if it's based on a period of record that you have, but it was commented that, for instance, under dissolved oxygen, that if you were at 4.0 milligrams per liter or 5.0 milligrams per liter, most people would think that's pretty good, not fair. That would be a good dissolved oxygen level. So there was some questions as to how FOS develops these scores, because the score for this week is actually for the areas for the inlet and for the intercoastal, the Indian River Lagoon remained B and C, but for the estuary, it's at a D level right now. So Mark, maybe that's something that you and I could talk about, or if you'd like to make a comment regarding the scoring
Well,
system.
we kind of use a state standard as 5 milligrams per liter. You know, in poor conditions are 0 to 3, and below 3, fish kills can occur. So between 3 and 5 is fair, and between 5 and 10 obviously is good. So that's kind of our scale that we based on, you know, pretty much state standard of 5 milligrams per liter for class 2 water.
Okay, appreciate that. And as you can see, this the FOS has a great resource of their citizen volunteer water quality monitoring network that help provide this information. So we're thankful to them for this. Next slide. So this is the most available satellite imagery. Actually, this is from last week, but there's another one this week, but it's still at, the lake is still at approximately 85% coverage from a week ago for blue-green algae status. There's, in the past week sampling, there's been 29 samples taken on the lake. 23 of the 29 samples had toxin detected. It did not indicate what levels the toxins were detected at, but it did say 23 of the 29 did have toxins detected. So luckily, we're not getting any Lake Okeechobee discharges, so we're safe for now. Next slide. Oh, I'm done. Any questions?
I'm seeing none, Chuck.
Okay. All right. Well, we're scooting right along. So the next item would be a group of 4 people who are going to speak a little bit about algal blooms. And I guess what I'd like to try is to let them go ahead and go through their presentations and then come back to questions at the end, just to sort of manage time a little more well, I guess. So if you have a question, just maybe jot it down, unless it's a question of clarification, in which case we can potentially pick it up. But I'd like to kind of hold most of the discussion to the end. So first up will be Ed Flips from the University of Florida, who does the sampling up in the northern and central part of the IRL. Over to you, Ed.
Oh, okay, good. You have it loaded. Okay. So I didn't exactly know what you wanted to see, so I did a little bit of a mixed bag. So I'm going to give you a little historical perspective and little driver issues, and then I can go to the most recent data if there's time. So you can see a lot of people have been involved with this. These are just some of the people who are involved currently or recently, and there's a lot more since 1997 that we've worked with. So can I click it, or do you have to click it for me?
I actually will click it for you because we've had problems with trying to get that to work.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, next, please. Just to update you, we have these sites. There's basically 6 sites. The top 5 are sampled since 2006, twice per month. And Sebastian is sampled once per month. That was it sometime twice per month, but before 2006, it was once per month. So we have Mosquito Lagoon, Titusville, Cocoa, Banana River, Central Banana River, Melbourne, and Sebastian. And the parameters, I'm going to focus on 5-point composition, biomass. I'm going to present it as micrograms of carbon per mil. And for those of you who are not familiar with that unit, very roughly about 1 is roughly equal to maybe 5 to 10 micrograms of chlorophyll per liter. So next, please. And we'll talk about nutrients, primary production, so forth. In any case, this is a time series from 1997 to current for the site in Titusville, Northern Indian River. A long time ago, I presented a meeting in Croatia for the first 10 years of the data set, and we thought we really had a great idea of how the dynamics were going, and of course we didn't really know what was about to happen. So before 2011, most of the blooms in this area were dominated by pyridinium, And there was a general relationship during high rainfall El Nino years, the Pyridinium blooms were stronger. And during El Nino or low rainfall years, they tend to be total biomass was a little bit less. But in 2011, as I think all of you know, there was a big change not only in the peaks, but also in the composition. Irma came in, cyanobacteria became even more important, nano eukaryotes also became very important. And you can see the peaks are very high, and also in many cases very prolonged in duration, which is a real problem in terms of the sea bass community. When blooms last more than just a month, they can last, in the case of like 2016-17 period, for over a year. And the main species are shown on the bottom, and the actual groups are shown in different colors, you can see on the bottom also. So next, please. So this is Southern Mosquito Lagoon, and we started sampling there in 2006, and you can see there wasn't much happening until after during 2011. And I won't go in a lot of detail, but the pattern is very similar to Titusville. There were a number of very large blooms, and began in 2011, which was at that time called the super bloom. And it seems somewhat diminutive relative to some of the other blooms, but anyway, it was called the super bloom at the time. And we had several other blooms subsequent to that that were even larger magnitude and duration. And at the end, I'll show you the most recent data in a little more cramped format so you can see more of the details. But that's the general pattern, similar to Titusville, a little bit different to some details. Next, please. And finally, this is Central Banana River. I'm not going to show all the sites. I just want to get the representative ones. Similar pattern to Titusville. This is from 1997. In 2011, we had that super bloom event. It was a bit of a hiatus. And then we returned to these large blooms, including some diatom blooms, some brown tide, Areomba lagulensis blooms, and nano eukaryotes, and also some Pyridinium blooms, of large magnitude. Next, please. And to compare with Sebastian, here's Sebastian over 1997 to current, and you can see it's very different, much lower biomass levels. The only two real dramatic peaks, if you want to call them that, were in 2016 and 2018, and they probably were imported from the northern Indian River Lagoon through water movement, because they were very short-lived and very sharp peaks that probably did not occur actually or start in that area of the lagoon. Next, please. So let's talk a little bit about the drivers for a second. So the difference between Sebastian and the other sites in the northern part, one of the driving factors is probably water residence time. In the northern part at the sites, 1.5, 2, and 3, water residence time is greater than 90 days, so plenty of time for even the slowest going bloom forming species to form large blooms. And at site 6, the water residence time is typically less than 14 days or much less than 14 days. And so that's obviously one of the main controlling factors. The other one probably would be the input of water from the Atlantic, which probably leads to higher levels of nitrogen limitation. We did nitrogen limitation bioassays, and that was indeed the case, that nitrogen limitation was predominant there. And there's a lot of phosphorus input to that region, so that makes sense. And so I'm going to go over a few slides to talk a little bit about shifts in climate conditions as it relates to dynamics of the blooms. A little bit about spatial temporal differences in nutrients. This slide is kind of mushed together, so it doesn't look quite right, but the spatial and temporal differences in nutrients, and talk a little bit about shifts in primary producer biomass other than phytoplankton. And you can't see the bottom of the screen, but I wasn't going to talk about that anyway, and that's top-down control, which I can talk about it another day. Next, please. So this is kind of interesting. This is a multi-parameter ENSO index, which is in blue. And so El Nino conditions would be positive values and La Nina conditions would be negative values. And the overlay is the Pyridinium cell densities in events over the sites that I showed you. And you can see that, actually all the sites, you can see that during El Nino periods, you have much higher biomass or paradigm in terms of bloom densities than during La Nina conditions. And I think in part that's related to differences in overall nutrient load. Now in a lot of systems, because El Nino is typically related to excessive nutrient load associated with excessive rainfall inputs during the winter and spring, but because of the really long water residence times, those nutrients tend to hang on into the late spring and summer. Next, please. So in a more generic, if you look at that more total phytoplankton biomass, you see the same pattern. And this is just events over the years, and La Nina followed by an El Nino, La Nina, you get the idea. And during the, if you go down the list, you can see that with the La Nina periods, for mean biomass over that period was lower than it is during El Nino, the subsequent El Nino, and then the same for the next two periods. And then after 2011, the values just bounce up in general. But the La Nina, El Nino relationship still holds. So next, please. And so let's talk about nutrients just for a second. I just took one site, which is the site in Titusville. And the top, of course, is phytoplankton biomass, and the bottom is nutrient concentrations. At this TKN and TP, these nutrient concentrations come from the Water Management District. And you see a couple of things. After 2011, you see a big uptick in TP concentrations, very dramatic. And the pattern after 2011 also, again, follows a little bit of the rainfall pattern, which makes sense. In terms of, except for in the first year. So in 2011, that was really a La Nina year. The rainfall was not particularly high. And so those nutrients came from somewhere. And I'll talk about that in a second. In terms of TKN, the values are a little less dramatic in terms of their increase, but there was an increase in that post-2011 period, but not as dramatic as the relative increase for TP. And you can see historically, if you go back to the El Nino high rainfall period of 2002 to 2007, you see again uptick in TP. Next, please. And this is another way of presenting this and seeing this. So the first panel on the left is the pre-2011 period, and the panel on the right is 2011 to 2018. And this is the annual average TP versus the annual average phytoplankton biomass. And it's pretty dramatically different. You can see on the right panel, slopes very, very sharp. And the concentration gradient, of course, the levels are on, a lot of them are higher than during the pre-2011 period, which makes sense. That's kind of shown in the previous slide. And the other thing is the slope is so steep, and why is it so steep? And I think part of the reason is that a lot of the species that are blooming in the post-2011 period, such as IRLNEP, can convert phosphorus into biomass very efficiently. And so I think you're getting a combination of higher TP levels and higher production of biomass relative to the amount of TP available. Next slide, please. TKN shows a similar picture, but you can see that the range of TKN values isn't that different in terms of pre-2011 and 2011 to 2018 period. The slope's a little sharper in the 2011-2018 period. And again, that also may be partly related to the fact that things like IRLNEP do a very good job, a very efficient job of taking up organic forms of nitrogen. That may enhance, again, their ability to use nitrogen to form biomass. But the R-squared relationships aren't as strong as in the case of TP. And so we tend to say that probably in this area, and then we did nutrient limitation bioassays that did show that phosphorus limitation does occur in these northern Indian River Lagoon, Mosquito Lagoon regions, as opposed to the central lagoon, which is predominated by nitrogen limitation. So I think you could have a situation where you have periodic nitrogen, phosphorus, or co-limitation in these regions in the northern part of the lagoon. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at this 2011, because it was actually a La Nina period, so you wouldn't expect a lot of external load in terms of rainfall abundances. So where did the biomass come from? So this comes out of a paper from 2015, and this data was actually from Laurie Morris and Bob Chamberlain's work and other people that worked with them. And you can see there was a dramatic drop in benthic primary producer biomass in 2011, 2012. That continues out. This just happens to be in this paper. So there's new data, more data now, of course. But you can see that the seagrass biomass went down, drift algae went down dramatically. And it varies a little bit from region to region. Oh, banana spelled wrong. Okay. Okay. But that I think is one of the messages is that, and when we did a relationship between the amount of decline in primary producer biomass, it more or less relatively well matched well with the increase in actual biomass of phytoplankton in the water column. So that was quite interesting. So I think part of the peaks in nutrients that showed up in 2011 were probably coming from the degradation of benthic primary producer biomass. And eventually you have a series of events that actually accentuate that process. And I'll talk about it for just a second in the next few slides. So next slide. So what caused the demise of the seagrass communities? Well, of course, that can be very complex. One of the possibilities is the 2 record cold temperatures in the winters of 2010, 2011 might have contributed to it. Some people say it's the higher salinity levels as a cofactor. Could be disease, could be many things. In any case, there was definitely a decline, and that decline has continued through many years subsequent to 2011. Next slide. So this is salinity. We talked about salinity. So the 2011 period was a drought period, and on the top there is the El Nino, La Nina periods shown. And you can see in 2011, that was in a period of increasing salinity in all 3 regions, indicative of the fact that this was a low rainfall year during that initiation of that super bloom. And next slide, please. And another interesting thing, of course, is the question of light availability. So I showed this. This is Secchi disk depth. And if you believe Dennison, Duarte, those people, Secchi disk depth probably is roughly equivalent to the depth at which you would expect to see a good growth of seagrasses. And you can see that in the case of post-2011 period, there's a lot of extended periods when the salinities, I mean the Secchi disk depths were below 0.5 meters, in some cases as low as 0.2 meters. And so these extended periods of that low Secchi is not good for seagrass community survival. And that probably contributed to subsequent mortalities of seagrass communities after 2011, after the initial beginnings of the collapse. And I don't know the most recent data because I haven't seen it, but I think some of the seagrass problems are still going on, but I'm not sure if there's been significant recovery recently. Laurie Morris or Bob Chamberlain will probably know that better than me at this point. Next, please. And so let's talk about just a more current, just to give you a more restricted period of time, just to see what's going on recently. Actually, I just included up to June, and basically the July samples in many of these areas, except for southern Mosquito Lagoon, Pyridinium's coming in fairly strongly. So here's the southern Mosquito Lagoon. You can see that big period of from 2015, 2017, major extended bloom. I think what's interesting about this figure is shows how those blooms of the Ario umbra and the nano eukaryotes actually came in and were very strong in the winter. And so it's obviously a fairly eurothermal species. And the fact that it comes in the winter is interesting because that's also, if you have an El Nino period when you have a lot of rainfall in the winter, that could have fueled some of this really high activity in the winter, which normally previous to 2011 we just didn't see that in the winter because the blooms are typically dominated by Pyridinium, which is a tropical species and doesn't really bloom until temperatures get above 20-25. Next, please. So here's northern Indian River Lagoon. Again, that big bloom in that period, 2015, 17, some fairly substantial blooms here in 2018, 19, and then seems to be tracking downward. Whether that's going to continue, we don't know. I know that some significant Pyridinium bloom activities going on in July. At least we've seen some samples, and also as FWC. So when we finish that data set, there'll be some blooms of pyro. And next, please. And here's the central banana river. And you can see some magnificent bloom activity here. Pyridinium blooms were very prominent, as well as Areombra, as well as nano-eukaryotes. And this bloom from 2070 through about 2090 was very dramatic. And now it's gone down. We'll see if it stays there. There are some strong Pyridinium blooms going on in the lagoon right now in July. And I think, one more, I think, and then I'm done. So, next, please. Oh, there it is. So it's a beautiful picture of brown tide, 2012, that Kelly Young took from the Volusia County Environmental. Anyway, any questions?
Thanks, Ed. How about if we just go ahead and move on to Malcolm, and then maybe we'll take some questions.
All right, can you all hear me? No?
You sound good, Malcolm.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, bro. Yep, you're good.
Okay, so I have been looking at the phytoplankton species in the southern half of the IRL, similar to Ed's project. We do not yet have the long time series that Ed has, but we're starting to accumulate enough data where we can start to see some patterns forming. So go ahead to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so our sampling sites are shown in the map there on the left. We're sampling 5 sites all the way stretching from Sebastian to the St. Lucie Estuary. We're collecting samples roughly every 2 weeks, and we bring those samples back into the lab and we're analyzing them for species composition, similar to what Ed is doing. I've been focusing more on individual species rather than grouping a lot of these into categories, but that may be something we'll end up doing in the near future. So we also have at these 5 sites continuously measuring LOBOs, which are measuring things like temperature, salinity, and nutrients. So we're able to correlate that data with our sample analyses directly. Okay, next slide. So these are some of the organisms that we're on the lookout for. These are HAB organisms that are commonly found in the IRL. On the left, the Sudanesia and the Microcystis are species that are pretty common and we see in the southern half of the lagoon. Oreombra and the Pyridinium are more common in the north, as Ed was talking about. And we don't usually see those in the southern half of the IRL, but we're always on the lookout to see if we see those things spreading into the southern half of the lagoon. So we're looking for some of these target harmful species, but we are measuring all the different phytoplankton species. We're counting all the different phytoplankton species that we see in our samples. So the next slide gives you a simple overview, including all the analyses that we've done to date. So our time series started in the fall of 2018. So this is almost 2 years worth of data. And this is just the mean species composition for these sites. So the most striking thing you see here is that our Sebastian site, on average, seems to have higher cell concentrations than most of the other sites. I've just listed the 10 most abundant species for all of our data on the right-hand side. You can see that most of these are not harmful species. They're diatoms, mostly, and they're generally considered good phytoplankton species to have around. But you can see that the second most abundant species is Sudanesia, and this is a toxic species that produces domoic acid. So this is a potential problem species, and we're seeing it lagoon-wide, well, throughout the southern half of the Indian River Lagoon, and it's pretty common. So it is the second orange bar in these stacked bar plots. You can also see that there's some differences between the sites at the SLE inlet site and the middle estuary site. We see some certain species of diatoms, Chaetoceros, that don't show up very abundantly elsewhere. The most abundant thing is the Skeletonema, which is a diatom, and that's a fairly ubiquitous species that is found all over the place. Okay, next slide. So we can also look at the data we've collected over time. This is our entire time series, starting in October 2018. And this is just total cell abundance for each of the 5 sites. And the first thing you notice about this graph is that it is incredibly noisy. So this data is highly variable over short time scales. And so it's going to take us probably a few years of data to really identify common patterns here. But I think some of these patterns are starting to emerge. All the sites are not the same. They behave differently. And you can see that more recently, sites like the Vero Beach site have seen total cell concentrations really shoot up, while others are more steady. And we can also look at just individual species in the same way. So in the next slide, I'm showing this is just our Pseudonychia, our toxic species that we're seeing pretty commonly throughout the lagoon. So again, this is some noisy data, but we're starting to see some maybe patterns that we can pull out of this data. There are times when, like in the late spring, early summer of 2019, where we seem to see high concentrations throughout the southern lagoon. And there are times when the concentrations are very different from station to station. Concentrations near the beginning of the time series were a little higher, and maybe they've decreased over time, especially in the Vero Beach and the middle estuary sites, which are further from inlets. We see that there are fewer of these species there. So in the next slide, what we've been doing is trying to correlate these species counts, the concentrations of individual species, with some of the environmental data that we're collecting from the Indian River Lagoon Observatory LOBO instruments. So we have hourly time series throughout our entire data set for things like chlorophyll, dissolved oxygen, temperature, salinity, and nutrients. There may be some new capabilities coming online in the near future, which will help discriminate different groups of algae, which would be interesting to look at. So we take pieces of this data that correlate to our sample times and locations, and we've been doing some multivariate analyses, which are shown in the next slide, to try and understand how the different species are behaving, including the toxic species, how they're behaving within the system. So this is a simple multivariate analysis, a principal components analysis that's combining some of the environmental data with our species abundance. So that the dots in the background represent our individual samples, and they're color-coded in this case according to their salinity. So the blue dots have low salinity, the red dots have high salinity. And then the vectors starting from the origin indicate the distribution of our different species throughout these samples. And what this plot is showing us is that the Pseudonychia in particular seems to be associated with these higher salinity samples. Something like the Leptocylindrus minimus near the top of the graph, in contrast, is associated with some lower salinity waters. So this is telling us a little something about where and when we may find Pseudonychia within the system, where what sort of environmental conditions it prefers and may lead to blooms of this particular species. So we may see it, for example, closer to the inlets, which seems to be what we're seeing more recently, rather than in these stations that are further from the inlets. It may be coming in with ocean water and finding a foothold in the lagoon, or it may be being outcompeted by other species in the fresher waters that come in from like the Sebastian River and the canals. So that's a basic overview of where we stand. Next slide just has some basic conclusions to date. So just to summarize, Sudanesia seems to be the most common and widespread hab in the southern part of the IRL. It's what we've seen most to date. Some other common species, however, that we do see, but are just not usually very abundant, are things like Demoic, Goniolax, Porocentrum. And of course, I forgot to mention the Microcystis here, but that also shows up periodically. These are important things that we want to keep our eye on, and we have seen, but have just not been dominant players in the system yet. And we're starting to get enough data to see some patterns emerging and trying to figure out how these organisms are behaving in the system. Some of the basic conclusions we have are, as I said, the Sebastian site has higher cell concentrations. One of the things that I think is pretty interesting is from the time series data, there's no strong seasonal patterns that we're pulling out in the southern half of the IRL, unlike the northern IRL. The patterns seem to be over longer timescales, interannual variation rather than seasonal variation. As we get more data, that may change. We may start to see more seasonal patterns. But as of now, it looks like variations from wet to dry season are not really controlling algae abundance. And as I said, Pseudonychia seems to prefer these higher salinity waters. So that's maybe where we need to worry about blooms of that. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Malcolm. Since we're going to head on to a different kind of topic, why don't we go ahead and take a couple questions now? So if you raise your hand, and Kayleen will pipe you in.
Did you, this is Ed, Ed Flips. Did you do any, have you done any Demoic acid tests at all?
Hey, Ed, yes, we are doing tests for Demoic acid, and it's something that we are seeing in low concentrations in many samples. So we've been using basic ELISA tests, which are, they're a little noisy. The data is a little bit difficult to interpret, but I believe we're getting positive hits for low to medium concentrations of Demoic acid. We need to confirm that by mass spectrometry to make sure that we're not seeing false positives. But I feel like we are seeing Demoic acid in many locations. The amount is not always correlated with cell concentrations, but it's also something that my colleagues, Matt Najimian and Annie Page Gargian, are seeing show up in some of the large animals in tissue biopsies. They're seeing Demoic acid show up. So it's something that seems to be getting into the system and into the food web as well. Yeah.
Yeah. You talked to Kate Hubbard at all about it?
Yes.
Yeah, because Kate, of course, she did her degree on.
Yes.
So that's a very interesting question that people have been tossing at me all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have a lot of blooms of Sudanesia in the northern part, but we haven't done any Demoic acid assays of it, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and we're also trying to figure out exactly what species that we're working with. So I have a master's student who is actually looking at Sudanesia, and she's trying to do some genotyping to get at species and also do a little SEM to see it, because we don't think we have one species. We think it's multiple species at different times.
Yeah, we've identified visually, microscopically, quite a few species that appear to be, like Calliantha is one. So yeah, I could send you the list we have and we see if it matches up with what you see. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
Okay, thank you.
So Valerie, did you have a question?
Yes, actually following up on that, now that the biosynthetic gene clusters for domoic acid are known, you probably could use some genetic tools to confirm their presence. And I know a lot of people in California have moved that in that direction. Kate might be familiar with that work. So I think that would be a really good way to, besides just mass spec, to confirm that the
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
genetic capacity is there for that. I had a different question for Ed. On a lot of your graphs, Ed, you had, and those are both really good presentations. Ed, you had a lot of other categories. In fact, in many cases, those dominated the graphs. What was included there?
Yeah, the problem is there's so many different nano-eukaryotes. And most of the other are nano-eukaryotes, at least, especially in those blooms. So there's such a diversity of them. You on a simple graph like that, it would just blow it away.
Yeah, but
way too complex. And so we decided just throw it another, but almost all of it is nano-eukaryotes.
Yeah.
There's a couple of species that are more dominant than others, but there's a high diversity. And some of them we don't even try to identify the species because they're small and nondescript and very difficult to speciate. So we just put them in a rough generic category. We know it's a nano-eukaryote, so
yeah.
So that's what we have to do to be realistic about what we can do microscopically.
Yeah, it's super interesting that they're so dominant. I mean, they're not really known to be toxic, but their presence dominating those samples is really interesting. And yes, I completely agree with you on, they all look alike microscopically. Trying to identify them that way is virtually impossible. And then when you do get into the molecular methods, as we did, with some of your samples with you, that's a big quagmire too, because the taxonomy is so terrible. So it's a big mess. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a big project for somebody.
Yeah, a lot of the sequences are not in the gene bank, so you
exactly.
I mean, a lot of times you're lucky to get at the family level.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
no,
but anyway, no, I think it's a fascinating thing that happened in 2011 because these blooms just didn't occur before 2011.
You said you were going to hint at where all that phosphorus was coming from. What?
Oh, it's a secret.
Okay. I was waiting for that.
No, I mean, that's a long story, right? I think initially, there was a lot of, remineralization of dead seagrasses, dead drift algae, dead everything else, right? And then I think subsequently, the external loads, which used to go into drift algae, epiphytes on seagrasses, I think went into the phytoplankton instead, and then probably destabilization of sediments. You're getting nutrients coming in from the sediments, adding to the phosphorus load. And historically, the seagrasses stabilize the sediments, reduce the transport of phosphorus into the water column, and then the epiphytes and the drift algae are competing with the phytoplankton for nutrients. So I think that big upsurge is a combination of all those factors and maybe more. And I haven't even talked about, septic tanks and groundwater inputs and so forth. But I think that's basically, it's a shift in where nutrients were going.
Yeah, no, we have a big phase shift. It's going to be hard to turn it around for sure.
Yeah, and I don't know what the most recent seagrass data says, but I'm interested in what they come up with, over the last year and this coming years.
Okay, Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was curious about, so up here in Brevard County, the Banana River has been, cloudy with every color algae bloom. We kind of joke about the rainbow algae blooms we get. And yet this past year, and this including this summer, the water's been clear and everybody's been claiming, is it because of COVID? And I was like, I don't see the relationship, but I know the why question is always hard to answer. But can you speculate, or do you have some, I mean, is it COVID that's causing the Banana River to be clear this year? You know, why is the Banana River looking so good this year when it's been blooming, you know, for the past years pretty densely?
I guess you're asking me. It's probably not COVID. We need to blame everything on COVID. It's so nice to blame everything on something. Yeah, I think part of it has to do with you know, whether you're coming out of a high rainfall period or not. And we've seen you know, this year until May was not a really high rainfall period over a period of 6 months. And then in late spring, we had some, I think Chuck mentioned that in his presentation, got quite a bit of rainfall. And I think that stimulated the big pyridinium blooms that are going on right now. I think it depends on what takes off first, right? And I think the question of rainfall and load is a really important one, and it varies from one year. We had periods of very low levels since 2011, occasionally. Like 2017 was a low period, 2013 was a low period, and those were all years when the external load probably was not as high because of low rainfall. That's one way. And then the other thing you could look at is top-down control, grazing control, but it's probably more related to, I think, load. Maybe my guess, but I don't have the data to show that yet anyway. So I'm guessing. It's a guess. It's either that or COVID. That's right.
Dwayne, did you have something?
At first, I just want to thank you both. You know, we're proud to be helping support this work, and when I see both of you speaking in these, you know, at the same time, it really showcases that spatial diversity kind of in the lagoon from north to south, and how we're going to maybe need to rethink as we move forward some of the management strategies, you know, related to this. You know, Valerie asked my phosphorus question, but I wanted to ask two. Number one, how big of a driver do you think temperature is in these new patterns that we're seeing?
Well, I can say from the analyses I've done in the southern half of the lagoon, temperature does not seem to be a major factor in the species that, you know, that we're seeing. So I'm sure it is an important factor at some level, but in the overall patterns that we're seeing, it does not seem to be dominant, controlling abundance.
I mean, yeah, I think temperatures in the northern part, I think, is important to the degree that you have because it's not the single factor working at one time. It's a multitude of factors working together. But the fact that we had major blooms of Aria umbra and some nano-eukaryotes during this post-2011 period, I think is interesting from a temperature perspective as well. So it's found further north than here. I think it's more eurythermal than like pyridinium. Pyridinium was such a dominant bloom former in the northern lagoon up until 2011. And it's a true tropical species. It doesn't really appear until temperatures get above 20, and it doesn't really take off until temperatures get above 25. So in that sense, temperature is an important factor in pyridinium blooms. And then the other thing we've seen, and this is a little more nebulous, but is the fact that some of the bloom-forming diatoms that we see in the northern lagoon, Rhizosolinia, Dactylia, Solon, you know, things like that, that consortium tends to bloom a little more commonly in the winter, so it's more cold tolerant, and that's not terribly surprising. It's quite a cosmopolitan species. It's found at much more northern latitudes. So I think in that sense, the community structure does have some seasonal component to it. And then periodically as we're getting into global warming, then we are going to be dealing with the issue of, the Pardinian bloom season was typically from around May through September. Is it now going to be from March through November? That kind of issue. And that could easily be an issue, not just from species composition, but just growth dynamics of being, that broader window of conditions ideal for bloom formation.
That's great. I'm not going to belabor this with my second question, but to give you guys a heads up, a little later in our meeting, we're going to be talking about work we've been doing with our local partners in transportation with 528 and 520 in Banana River Lagoon as it relates to water flow. So expanding those causeways could, decreasing the causeway, expanding a bridge span could improve flow by between 9 and 17%. And I know our friends at Florida Institute of Technology are working on a kind of an ocean enhanced flow research project funded by the legislature. And so one of the things we're going to have to come together on at some point is these synergies you mentioned, Ed. So, we see these patterns, a lot we don't understand about the biological response to these, the synergies of temperature, salinity, top down. And so flow is going to be on the table for us to consider, and in fact is with these causeways. And so it's going to be an interesting management series of discussions and decisions to be made as we move forward. So I just want to thank you again for your work, and you can see the value of these long-term data sets. So it's our intent to keep this work going so we continue it. So thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for the support.
Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. And I would add, in the southern half of the Indian River Lagoon, temperature probably is really important, and seasonal cycles are probably really important for Microcystis. It just so happens that we haven't seen major discharges for our data set so far, and so we haven't captured that yet. But temperature is really important for Microcystis growth on the lake, and there's strong seasonal cycles. So if those coincide with releases, then that's a huge factor for the southern part of the lagoon and the St. Lucie Estuary in particular.
Well, Malcolm, I'm kind of hoping you have to wait a while for that data set.
I kind of hope so too, but the lake level is slowly rising. Hopefully it won't get to a critical stage before the bloom starts to die down. We'll see.
Thank you.
Hey, Mark, did you have something?
Yeah, just quickly, I had a question for Malcolm. At the end of your talk, you were talking about it not really seeing any seasonality to these issues. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I didn't quite catch, you went through it quick. So
yeah, it's something that we're not really pulling out of the data that we have yet. With the species that we're looking at that are dominating in our data, they don't really seem to have strong seasonal patterns of abundance, which I think is kind of interesting, because that would normally be what you would expect to see, a seasonal bloom cycle. But that's not really what we're seeing, because probably partly because the system is really so dynamic. Those time series plots are incredibly noisy. There's a lot going on there that is controlling the abundance, and it's really hard to tease apart exactly what the driving factors are.
Excellent. Yeah. And just to follow up on Dwayne's comment, down here at the southern end of the lagoon, we were able to kind of redesign some of the causeway islands at the Stewart Causeway when they redid the bridge, and we were able to open up 26% more by reducing some of the causeway islands by several hundred feet. So we opened up tidal flow from the St. Lucie Inlet up into the lagoon a little bit better by reducing those causeway islands.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. Okay.
Margie?
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had actually lowered my hand since I thought we were past that level of from the presentations and level of detail. But I did want to point out something we've noticed. To a couple of things regarding the phosphorus bump ups that we had in 2011, and that happened actually. The phosphorus appeared before the blooms reacted to the phosphorus, and so basically in 2010 is when early 2010, February of 2010 more or less, is when we had the big noticeable bump up of total phosphorus and total dissolved phosphorus. And and Ed, the way you explained all the different factors that have been feeding into this higher nutrient status of the lagoon since all the changes started happening with increased phytoplankton, decreased light availability, and the decline in the seagrasses, and more of that, the nutrients now not being bound in the benthic biota, but rather being available and all that. And that all explains how things have just stayed up there and have been actually getting even higher in terms of nutrient availability, especially phosphorus. I just wanted to mention something else that could have happened back as one additional component that may have contributed to it, that kind of could explain why phosphorus went up so quickly after that very cold winter we had in 2009, early 2010. It was actually in January. And if this was, I mean, we had the turtles up in Mosquito Lagoon that were surfacing and needed to be rescued. We had pictures of boats full of dead snook that were scooped off by NASA people and put in their boat.
Marty?
Yes.
Wrap it up.
Yes. So there was mortality of the biota in the lagoon from this very deep cold spell. And with that, if the biota, that carcasses and sink, there's a drop in dissolved oxygen. And I think even though we have absolutely no way to prove it because we have not been monitoring oxygen levels at the sediment water interface, it could very well be that another contributing factor to the release of phosphorus that was so discrete in time at that time could be because it was released not just from the decomposing material, which was a certain amount, but also from the sediments of phosphorus that had been stored in the sediments. When the redox conditions are right, gets released from the sediments. And that could have then just been available then for the phytoplankton to pick up. So that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to point out to everybody was the Irma. So we've seen another bump up yet since Irma. Irma seems to have had a significant effect, and the 2018 bad year that we've seen throughout the Florida, I mean, especially in Banana River, could be attributed to those loads from Irma. So I wanted to point out Irma since it wasn't mentioned as another critical. Okay, that's it. My 2 cents worth.
Mitch, did you have something?
Just, I was going to ask the same question Mark did, but I was also wanted to bring up to both Ed and Malcolm, please consider wind dynamics and wind mixing an overturn in the bottom, particularly as it drives the species back up into the photozone for dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, because it's so shallow. And the fetch in the lagoon is quite large. It's broad, it's big. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, that's an important factor.
Yeah, wind and tidal mixing both are huge factors in making our data really noisy, I think, because things are always moving around. Things are always coming in and out of the inlet. They're getting mixed up. That's a big factor. Really hard to tease that apart. And I think the best way to do that is just to collect more data. And when you start to look at longer and longer time series, you can average over those short-term noisy effects.
I think, but and just not to belabor, just the principal components analysis part, if you put wind in there as with the other factors, it might tease out that way.
Yeah.
Mitch. Okay, we're going to move on. See if we can get Tom Fraser to tell us a little bit about the Blue-Green Algal Task Force.
All right, thanks, Chuck. So yeah, again, I thought I'd just give everybody a little update of where we've been and where we're headed. So We'll just pop right into the next slide. So I think, again, most people know that the task force was established by Governor DeSantis under Executive Order 1912, just a couple of days after he took office. And the task force is comprised of 5 well-accomplished scholars. 2 of them are right in your backyard for sure. You got Val Paul and Jim Sullivan. And so I have the pleasure really of facilitating their discussions and their deliberations, but what I do also is kind of capture their input and synthesize that input, and so kind of tie it all together. The task force last year started meeting in the summer, had a series of meetings. They were on a very aggressive time scale, in large part because of the early legislative session, but all the meetings were open to the public. They're very transparent. That process, will continue to be very transparent. We very much value public participation and stakeholder participation. So it's been a little rough over the last couple of months. Obviously, COVID's put a damper on things. It's changed the way that we do business. But for those of you who don't know, we are having our first task force meeting of 2020 tomorrow, and that'll be a virtual meeting. But again, there will be ample opportunity for the public to participate in that meeting. So our first consensus document was released in October of 2019, and it was focused in large part on nutrients that are nutrient sources that are contributing to harmful algal blooms. So we tackled issues related to basin management action plans, ag BMPs, septic systems, sanitary sewer overflows, stormwater systems, innovative technology. We dealt with public health issues and also science and how it affected decision making. So it was a lot of work in a fairly short period of time, but less than a week after that the task force published its consensus document, the governor put forth a series of recommendations that were subsequently rolled into a legislative bill that was sponsored by Senator Mayfield, and that bill is known as Senate Bill 7112 and is referred to as the Clean Waterways Act. So it's a fairly comprehensive, was a fairly comprehensive piece of water quality legislation. And again, it dealt with a lot of different issues, and it was passed unanimously in the House and then just recently signed into law by the governor. So what I thought I would do is, if we go to the next slide, is kind of just hit some of the highlights of the recommendations that were in that consensus document, some of the things that found their way into the Clean Waterways Act, and what the significance of those recommendations, I guess, and items were. So it's not a big surprise or to anybody in this audience for sure. BMAPs are an important part of what we do. They are essentially the roadmaps for restoration of impaired waters, and they're comprised of a suite of projects, right, intended to reduce pollutants to achieve a specific restoration target. The plans, again, as you know, are developed in collaboration with local stakeholders, and we rely, on local input and local commitment before they're actually adopted by secretarial order to be enforceable. So what the task force really wanted to do is they wanted to accelerate progress toward the restoration of impaired water bodies. And so they recommended a more strategic and targeted approach to project selection and implementation. And so with regard to Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie Estuary BMAP areas, the task force acknowledged a couple things. First of all, they continue to appreciate and again acknowledge that regional storage and treatment infrastructure is urgently needed to manage flows to reduce the damaging freshwater discharges to the northern estuaries, and to achieve the TMDLs and also establish some of the recently established numeric nutrient criteria. So siting and design and funding of this infrastructure was recommended as continue to be a priority, and I think you would see that recent investments in Everglade restoration are consistent with this recommendation. Looking forward, the task force also recommended that projected changes in demographics and land use where possible be incorporated into the planning process. And, again, we recognize that the BMPs are actually living documents, right? And we should expect to update those plans and projects as new science and better information become available. As part of that, their deliberations, the task force also recognized that legacy nutrients were important both on the land and in the lake sediments, Lake Okeechobee in particular, and some priority should be given to those projects that could address the legacy nutrient loading issues. And then finally, additional monitoring was recommended to better evaluate the effectiveness of restoration projects within BMAP areas. So next slide. So as we got into some of the key nutrient sources, and everybody I think recognizes that agricultural operations can be a significant source of nutrients to our waterways. But what the task force recognized was that the BMPs in and of themselves weren't sufficient to achieve water quality restoration targets, right? And so we wanted to do something a little more aggressive on that front, and the Clean Waterways Act actually requires that DACs to complete on-site inspections at sites using BMPs at least once every 2 years to ensure program compliance. There was a fair amount of concern that those inspections weren't being done on a timely manner. And I think, when you actually look at the legislation as a major step forward, the bill required documentation of fertilizer use to aid in an effective evaluation of BMPs on those agricultural parcels. And so one of the other things that came out of the legislation was that the University of Florida, IFAS, and other universities, not just UF IFAS, were requested annually to develop research plans and legislative budget requests to enhance or develop additional BMPs and identify additional nutrient reduction projects. So we look forward to seeing those projects, this coming year. Next slide. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about septic systems, and I know it's a topic that you guys cover quite a bit. And one of the things that the task force recommended here was broader regulatory oversight of septic systems. And very specifically, the task force recommended that DEP develop a comprehensive regulatory program to ensure that septic systems were protective not only of human health, but also protected the environment against nutrient pollution. So in the Clean Waterways Act, what you saw was that regulation of septic tanks as would be recognized as a source of nutrients, and there was transfer of oversight from the Department of Health to the DEP for that purpose, and that transfer was effective July 1st, 2021. Next slide. So, sanitary sewer overflows continue to be a big problem throughout Florida, and they pose significant risk, I think, again, as everybody understands, not only to public health, but to the environment as well. So, again, the task force recognized the significance of the issue. They recommended that every effort should be made to minimize the occurrence of SSOs and their potential negative environmental and health impacts. And so, again, what happened when those recommendations came out and the way that they were incorporated into the Clean Waterways Act, there was a contingency plan, essentially, that for power outages to minimize discharges of untreated water. And there was also a provision to provide financial records from all sanitary sewage disposal facilities so that the DEP could ensure that the funds were being allocated to appropriately for infrastructure upgrades, repairs, and maintenance that prevent systems from falling into kind of a state of disrepair. So the legislation also required utilities to develop inspection, maintenance, and replacement improvement plans for all of their systems. So again, I think there's a lot of action on that front and attempt to improve the system in that regard. Next slide. So, I mean, again, we have a number of aging stormwater systems across the strait, and stormwater has become probably one of the largest potential non-point sources of pollution throughout Florida. And so one of the things that the task force recommended was the development and implementation of a stormwater system inspection and monitoring program, excuse me, with a goal of identifying improperly functioning and or failing systems so that corrective action could be taken to reduce nutrient pollution and other negative environmental impacts. So again, in my view, it's a step forward in the fact that the Clean Waterways Act required the department to update stormwater rules and design criteria to improve the performance of stormwater systems statewide. And again, the legislation requires that the water management districts and the DEP initiate rulemaking using the most up-to-date scientific information to update again that stormwater design criteria in operation of regulations by January 1st, 2021. Next slide. So, again, moving on from kind of those areas that were specific to nutrient sources, there was a recognition that we could invest more in innovative technologies. And in fact, that the task force recommended that we invest in a diverse portfolio of projects. And based on those recommendations, the dedicated funding was provided again this year for more innovative technologies. The projects, again, they're focused on a number of different things. At first, there was, if you look back at 2017 and 2018, there was a lot of technologies that were going towards mitigation and cleanup. We've had a relatively mild year with regard to harmful algal blooms in many cases, and so some of those a greater proportion of those dollars could be focused on projects that were more preventative in nature, but we will continue to make investments in technologies that aid in mitigation and cleanup, but also technologies that will help us better forecast and predict bloom occurrence. So again, I think there's a wide suite of opportunities for people to tap into that resource to do some very interesting things. If we go to the next slide. So with regard to public health and algal blooms, I mean, it was clear to the task force that we need a better coordination between the agencies. And the task force recommended very specifically that the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Protection implement a transparent and consistent communication plan to inform the public about water conditions and the potential health impacts associated with exposure to blue-green algae and or algal toxins. So in fact, that's the primary topic of our discussion tomorrow. How do we do a better job of coordinating our efforts? How do we get some consistent messaging that appeals to the diverse population that we have in Florida? How do we get it out in a timely manner? We've been working pretty diligently, I guess, on a website that allows access to information related to harmful algal blooms, blue-green algae in particular, but also working with the FWC and the DOH to incorporate red tide information, nutrient status of various water bodies and things of that nature. And so we should be rolling out a revised version of that pretty soon. I think people will be considered a fairly marked improvement to what we had before, but we continue to work on that. So next slide. Again, one of the things that the task force recommended was that we had a renewed investment in a statewide comprehensive water quality and sampling and monitoring strategy. And I mean, it's key to what we do, and certainly in the agency, the decisions that we make need to be science-based. And in order to do that, you need the appropriate information. So I think we're making good progress on that front. And at the time, at least last year, given the focus, I guess, on blue-green algae blooms in Lake Okeechobee and the northern estuaries, the task force recommended an expanded water quality monitoring program in each of those relevant BMAP areas. So that would be the Lake Okeechobee BMAP area, Caloosahatchee, and St. Lucie. And again, I think we've made really good progress over the last year, and you'll see that in our sampling effort. We've worked very closely with the Water Management District, South Florida Water Management District, to fill in some data gaps with regard to water quality monitoring stations that'll allow us to better evaluate the effectiveness of specific projects that we're implementing in those basins. And the same thing with the St. Johns River Water Management District. And as we're moving forward over the last year, we've also been, again, this is a statewide effort. We initially kind of started in South Florida, but we're moving our way all across the state. So we're working also with Southwest Florida Water Management District, Swanee River Water Management District, and Northwest as well. And they've been good partners, and I expect to see improvements in our monitoring efforts across the state this coming year. So next slide. So, again, I just want to remind everybody, I thought it was a very productive year. It's really encouraging from my perspective to see those recommendations that came out of a scientific kind of body to help inform policy. And so I think we're going to continue to work in that vein. Our next meeting is tomorrow. I would encourage people to certainly tune in if they're interested. We're going to focus on public health issues. Again, EPA has some recommendations out with regard to recreational water quality advisories and swimming advisories. We're going to have a discussion about how we might act on those recommendations and how we might better message the risk associated with blue-green algae blooms and toxins to the public. So I think with that said, I'll turn it back over to Chuck. Thank you, guys.
Okay, I'll go through the information for the harmful algal bloom / red tide task force. We kind of have a split personality. And then we'll come back to some questions. So the harmful algal bloom red tide task force is actually a revitalization of a task force that was created in 1999. In this version, it has 11 members, Don Anderson from Woods Hole, Dwayne DeFries, Quay Dortch from NOAA, Jill Flieger from FDAX in their aquaculture group, Leanne Fuellings, who's part of the FWC HAB group, Barb Kirkpatrick from GCUS, who has a background in epidemiology, Sherry Larkin from UF, who does economics, Andy Wright from FDOH, who's going to retire soon, so he'll be replaced. Rhonda Watkins from Collier County, that's their environmental specialist, Dave Whiting from DEP, and myself. So we're going to try to move beyond red tide. As Tom pointed out, this last year, people were trying to run as fast as they could, so the focus pretty much stayed on red tide. That kind of gave us blue, greens, and red tide at the same time, as it were. But they're certainly looking for people to bring suggestions for how they can interact. And that includes working in the Indian River Lagoon, where some of the folks have worked for quite some time. One of the things that we did do was endorse the recommendations from the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, because that dealt with a whole group of things that we could then set aside to some extent in this initial run at it. We released our own set of initial recommendations. You can get those online through the FWC website that has all the red tide material, red tide task force material on it. We looked at public health, where again, one of the concerns was improving our understanding of how red tide affects people, with the recognition that pets and other animals are, also have to be considered as well as the ecosystem. We're looking to have some sort of long-term strategy to improve communication and education. Again, in this initial go, focused on red tides. We supported this Protecting Florida Together website and trying to use that as a portal to get information out. Management and response, the focus was on some sort of comprehensive red tide response plan, as well as looking at ways to control blooms once they've started, And then coming around on the back end is to improve the estimates of the economic impacts of red tide, so that you have something to take to people to, help them understand the challenges. Research, we looked at research, ocean observations to improve forecasts and expand management options was one of the key things that came out of our deliberations. Looking to try to get an ensemble of red tide models that would allow us, give us some predictive ability. Also looking to get a better means of detecting both the cells and potentially the toxins in like real time. And then looking into research into mitigation and control of blooms, which is the part of the world where moat has their major focus. And again, there are people who are links with that work going on there. So this past year, we released a request for proposals, and there'll be 2 proposals that'll be funded. They're up on the website now as well. Whoops, we're not moving slides. Can you move the slides forward a few for me, Kayleen? There we go. So just back 1 is good. So the 2 proposals that'll get funded would be the beginning of the communications plan, which will come through the University of Florida, Florida Sea Grant. And the second one is testing and use of an in situ holographic imaging system, which is going to be led out of FAU, our branch. There were some remaining funds, and those are under debate at the moment, exactly how to use those. May roll those forward. Next, please. Where we're headed is there was some more funding provided. It actually is even a little more than they asked for. So there are several uses that have come to the fore for that. One is to enhance the existing work with both Moat and University of South Florida. That's on sort of detecting and predicting red tides. There'll be monies put into supporting the task force itself. There will be another round of grants coming up. There will be some focus on enhancing some of the existing things that are going on and expanding the collaborations where we can. FWC also received 2 dedicated full-time positions. One will become the director of the Center for Red Tide Research, and the other one will act as a kind of liaison with the task force. And I think that's the last one. So, anybody have any questions?
Mitch does. Tom, do you have an available matrix that shows your recommendations versus actions that are publicly available?
So one of the things that we have done is, and I can see if I could put that together for you, Mitch. We certainly tracked the legislation pretty closely and to figure out which of those recommendations were adopted and what are the actionable items moving forward. So I'll see if I can get the guys to pull that together for you. If you just drop me a note and remind me to do that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mark?
Yeah. Hey, Chuck, did the task force that was kind of resurrected, and I recall it back in '99, is there a crossover between that task force now, the new, the revised one, and the blue-green algae task force? Are you kind of doing similar things, or going to have similar results in work? Or
I think once again, I think this first year might have been, I guess, surprising how parallel things went. But I anticipated in the future that there will be more formal interactions, as it were. Once all the pieces have kind of gotten on their feet. So you've had monies put into Moat, you've had monies put into the blue-green task force and the red tide task force, and we have to sort of get that together. And I think we'll be doing that as we go forward.
I would agree with that. I would just say something as well. I think, some of the endpoints that we're striving for, just there's so much overlap. You know, there's a tremendous amount of work that we need to do to kind of get some consistent messaging and communication plans together. We're already working kind of collaboratively on our Protecting Florida Together website. So you'll see, again, blue-green algae and red tide in the same places. I mean, nutrients drive a lot of these problems. And so trying to make that information available so that it's, again, broadly applicable and it can deal with any number of kind of water quality related issues, not just blue-green algae blooms or red tide, but as you know, there's all kinds of issues. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I would hope there is going to be this kind of collaborative effort, because you know the algae task force should all be kind of working together on all the harmful algal. I know red tide research has been going on for many years through Moat and others over on the West Coast, but to bring it together under a kind of a broader scope would be good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think again, I think that is, you know, part of the driving force is to bring what we have together and make good use of it, and then decide where it is we need to go next. So
great, thanks.
And any others? Kayleen, do you see anybody else?
I see nobody else.
Okay, well, we'll move on then.
Hey, Chuck, before you move on, I'm going to jump in and just want to thank all of the speakers. Really appreciate your taking the time, and also want to congratulate Tom. Many of you know him as the first Chief Science Officer of Florida. You may not know that he's accepted a position with University of South Florida as the new Dean of College of Marine Sciences. So we look forward to working with you in that new capacity. Since we've got 3 NEPs over in your neck of the woods, and just wanted to say thanks for all of your work as Chief Science Officer, and you know, good luck in this transition. I know you're juggling a lot of balls right now, so we appreciate your time today.
Hey, Dwayne, really appreciate the kind words, and so I certainly look forward to continuing to work with you guys. It'll be good.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yep, let me add my thanks to the speakers for taking part in today, and appreciate it. Okay, moving on to
Chuck?
Yep.
I just want to point out that we are precariously close to losing a quorum.
Yes.
One more of our members leave, we no longer have a quorum.
Okay. Well, let's move through these then. The planning documents, Dennis.
So a point of information, if I leave, I don't have to give this talk?
No, you still have to give the talk. We just don't give you any
Okay.
congratulations.
And now you all know that me and Tom are hanging out the same location. So Tom, it's your bye. All right, I'm ready. 3 minutes, right?
3 minutes, timer's going.
Okay, so you all know what we've been doing. I've explained that over longer presentations in the past. So hopefully you remember everything I said before. And you know that we are heavily focused on connecting the monitoring plan with the vital signs. And so we put together tables that are the categories of vital signs, kind of as a starting point for gathering information. We built a questionnaire up, and we have over 110 people that or projects that we've been communicating with over the last several months. And we are also, you had seen an early version of a draft table of contents. I said that's our roadmap. We now have 2 roadmaps. The second roadmap is an agenda for our virtual workshop, which now likely will be held in November. There'll be a lot of data collectors and users there, as both. Buyers and sellers is the expression that Dwayne used once that I kind of like when it comes to data. And different members of our steering committee will present aspects of our proposed monitoring plan. And again, it all revolves around these categories of vital signs that are so important to the CCNP. One of the things that we're going to try really hard to do during the workshop is, since we know we can't do things in person anymore, why not take advantage of the technology as best we can? And we will be doing some presentations and then doing some very quick real-time surveys that will guide us in terms of priorities for the final report and recommendations. The next slide shows you what we plan to do in the coming quarter. Basically, our data collecting or information gathering portion will finish with all those questionnaires put together, synthesized. And then we will organize the material to develop the monitoring plan that will have a lot of documentation, including GIS maps. We decided very on, you may remember, we had criteria for inclusion in the monitoring program, but we also want to be very inclusive in our fact finding. So a lot of these projects are very short-term projects that probably won't be part of the long-term monitoring plan, but we think it's really important to keep them, and we're not going to lose anything that we do get, and we will comment in a general way, at least on some of the projects, beyond just the program. So we plan to schedule that meeting and organize things in October, November, finalize the participant list. And one of the things will be that I expect to invite everybody that's on the STEM AC to participate in the workshop. We have some people that are already involved in the steering committee, but we'd like everyone to be involved. So you certainly will all be invited. And then we'll work on the final report. And then my last slide, we were asked by Dwayne to comment on, next slide, on what the management conference can do for us. Well, first of all, anytime you have questions or input, you're free to let me know, or if you can't remember how to find me, you know how to find Dwayne, and Dwayne is on a steering committee. And we do expect that we'll have, as I said, participation from both the management board and the STEM AC at the actual workshop. And then of course, we expect that everybody on these groups would do a real thorough review of the draft monitoring plan. Thanks.
Okay, we'll just move right ahead unless someone has a burning issue of clarification. Okay, Marcy, is this?
Yep, good afternoon. I'm here to give an update on the habitat plan. So to date, we have submitted the initial draft plan to the NEP staff at the end of May. We received a lot of good feedback from Dwayne on that version. So we went ahead and made updates on that, added some additional information. We actually just also did a reorg on the table of contents to make it flow a little bit better. And then in June and July, we sent out some requests for some additional information for what we're calling our habitat experts. As of today, we've received feedback from our experts on the seagrass, mangroves, wetlands, salt marshes, living shorelines, spoil islands, human-built artificial reefs, inlets, and managed mosquito impoundments. So we really appreciate all of you have taken the time to give us that feedback to date. On the next slide, we are working to update the draft to send the next version back to the NEP staff the end of this month, which is Friday. After they have a chance to look through that, we plan to send it out to the entire management conference, including you all. We're aiming for mid-August for that review. That will be out for a few weeks for you all to look at and comment on. And we are still targeting finalizing the document by September 30th. That might have to slip just a little bit, just depending on the level of comments and if any additional literature and data come in that we need to factor in. So to get there on the next slide, in order for us to finalize the document, we do still need some input. There was a few folks, a few of our habitat experts that we emailed that we haven't heard back from yet. So if any of you might have information, we're looking for some more detail to help with the habitats for water column, submerged bottom, and filter feeders for both oysters and clams. And specifically, we're looking for recommendations for what restoration of these habitats look like, what would be considered success, the short-term outcomes within the next 5 years or so of that restoration, and the longer-term outcomes looking out to about 10 years or longer. So if you all have any information on those habitats, or even some of the ones that we've already gotten some feedback, we'd appreciate that. You can reach out either to myself, Marcy Frick, or Rob Barron, and I believe you have both of our contact information from past presentations. So thank you.
Thanks, Marcy. So who's here for the State of the Lagoon?
That's me, Zach Leibowitz.
Okay, take it away.
All right, so we're talking about two different projects we're working on here. One is the lagoon-wide asset mapping, and the other is the State of Lagoon technical report. Next slide.
Zachary, we can barely hear you. Can you get closer to your microphone?
I can try, but my face is gonna get bigger.
That's okay. At least we'll be able to hear you. We won't look. We promise.
Okay, all right. Oh man, the big face. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. Is this better? Are you able to hear me better? All
Yeah,
right.
that seems better.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I eat into some precious time, so I'll go as fast as I can. So in terms of progress in the last quarter, the lagoon-wide asset mapping, we've put together all the conservation land maps and also used aerial imagery to update the coastal wetland coverage. In terms of the technical report, that's kind of been taking up a lot of my time personally, and it's been great. So we've been very busy. We produced a conceptual IRL health diagram to kind of look at all the indicators and conditions and stressors. We've held a steering committee meeting to discuss that diagram, so we keep getting great input from all of our members. We've assembled our tech, and probably the big thing that we've been working on is what we're calling the literature review and data synthesis database. So that's kind of combining this digital library as well as the data availability matrix, where we're looking at spatial and temporal coverage. We've got up to about 300 articles there, and we're looking on building more. Next slide. Everyone left their post? No? We'll go to the next slide.
He's coming.
There we go. Okay, so the path forward, what we're looking for, we pretty much wrapped up the conservation mapping. We're going to look at what else we can get from, let's see, sorry. And well, what we're most looking for is getting comments in terms of the map products and comments from the members there, and assembling our different mapping priorities for the next year, which we'll have to do probably a lot with our technical report. And as far as the technical report, our path forward, we're looking at the kickoff meeting with the TAC coming up soon, continuing this literature review effort because you guys keep publishing great stuff, and redesigning the conceptual IRL health diagram. So that's going to be based on the input. We're looking at putting together 2 or 3 different options and having a vote. We can go ahead to the next slide. So our current needs, of course, is getting that feedback from you all on the maps we have, and some other maps that we can be working on. Hopefully those will be aligning with the technical report in terms of what we can put in the background, whether it's landscape, stormwater infrastructure. And for the State of Lagoon technical report, any relevant literature you all that we don't currently have included in our digital library, particularly new publications or very old publications or government reports, any other data sets that weren't identified originally in the synthesis memorandum or included in our database. And of course, any ideas you have for the IRL health diagram. So we'll be voting on that. And as far as the workshop, it's going to be in this fall. And unfortunately, we're not able to do it in person, it looks like. So that will be online. I think that's it.
Thank you. Dr. Soto.
Hello. Happy World Conservation Day, everybody. I'm going to talk about the Indian River Lagoon Boater's Guide. Next slide. So MRC has been working with FWRI, as you know, and our role has been to help ground truth the local data. And thanks to our steering committee that we assembled as part of this grant, we got all those data collected for the marinas, the restaurants, and the fishing piers. And I got to give a shout out to Janet Zimmerman of Find, and Debbie and Chad up in Volusia, and Brevard counties, Matt Culver, who were really out there collecting a lot of these data for us. And we got all the data into FWRI, and they have compiled them into a database, and they are doing their metadata cartographic standards, and they're starting to lay out the map grid. So they've started doing the mapping work, and they are delayed, and we are going to request formally a 6-month extension. And I'm getting those dates from FWRI now and should get those to you by the end of this week. Next slide. So the next steps are we're working with the Clean Marina program on information from them on the clean marinas and how you can become one. We continue to work with the Coast Guard Auxiliary on the boating safety content for the Boater's Guide. And we're looking at probably getting our first draft out now, the beginning of next year, beginning January 2021 or so. So we'll be looking to you all to help with review of the draft guide. And we're still looking for a printer contact. FWRI thinks it'll be easier for us to lay out things if we know where it's going next. Next slide. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, Dwayne, I'm just going to ask you to blow through all three.
Yeah, I'm going to blow through all three in less than 3. So everybody's been tracking Randy Parkinson's work on climate change. Kayleen, you can take me 2 slides down. There's lots of steps involved in this to meet the obligations of EPA. Randy has really synthesized this down to clear recommendations. And so we are now assembling both the phase 1 and phase 2 in a single document. We will also assemble as staff into a community guide, and then we will be bringing that document back to you all in the November framework just for formal adoption. And so we will be one of 2 estuaries in the nation in the NEP program that have climate-ready estuary plans in place. Next slide. We also are obligated under our agreements with the EPA to do a separate strategy for funding. We submitted a document to the Management Board Finance Subcommittee this morning. They are going to review and make some changes, and as soon as we get that version, we will be sending it out to you all in the STEM AC, probably within a week or 2 weeks for review. Our plan is to have this adopted by November as well, and this is a really high-level look that basically shows where federal, state, and local decisions can happen for looking at funds. We hope it's a really good tool, and we'll get this to you as soon as the finance subcommittee's taken a look at it. And we're looking for you to, if you know where funding exists and I've missed something, what I'm asking for is fill in the gaps. This isn't every single grant program, but if you know of sources of funds that somehow I overlooked, we're going to be looking to take that information in so it becomes a broad, usable document. And the reality of this is, if we got to spend $5 billion to get to where we want to be for the Indian River Lagoon, we want to do it in 20 years, and we're going to need to, find $250 million a year to get there. So how does that work? Next slide, and then I'll take questions from anybody when we're all done. Lastly, many of you remember that we started a Science 2030 kind of process a while back, and Chuck and I have basically revitalized it. We've cleaned up a draft. We will be sending this to you probably the end of this week, the first of next. This is really raw, really basic. It's what you brought in collectively as the big topics, and we're going to want your input, and then we will work. And Chuck was thinking maybe set up a task force within the STEM AC to start to build this into a good vision for 2030. What are the big science questions that need to be addressed for the Indian River Lagoon? And so stay tuned. You'll get to look at kind of where we left this off about 2 years ago when we first started to contemplate it. Fast enough, Chuck?
That was wonderful, Dwayne. And what I'm going to ask people to do is if they have a question, just type it in the chat box and we'll either get to it at the end or we'll get back to you later. But we'll have it for sure. So before I lose my quorum and fail miserably as the chair once again.
Well, the good news, if we lose the quorum, you know, we're just going to make recommendations without, but we'd love to have everybody stay on. We're almost there.
Yep, we're getting there.
So we all talked about the RFPs for 2022. All this does is, you know, basically sets the target numbers. We were reluctant to put any targets on these because of COVID. And we've decided to move business as usual until we realize we're not doing business as usual. And so in these RFPs, there'll be a little bit of language about COVID and the fact that the board has their discretion to decide how funds would be distributed. And so our recommendation as staff is to hold the levels at the same level we had last year. So basically it would be, is there another slide, Kayleen? 500,000 for water quality, 200,000 for habitat restoration, 200,000 for community-based restoration, and up to 100,000 for science and technology. And that's really just to make sure that our applicants kind of see what the range of opportunity would be. And then we'll move forward as we start looking at 2022 in a budgeting format starting in November. So we'll need just a motion to approve those level or recommend those levels to council.
So can I get a motion? Well,
motion to recommend.
Is that you, Bob?
Yep.
And a second?
Second.
That was Rich. Any discussion? Okay, once again, the way we're going to do this is if you do not want to recommend that we take those levels forward, now's the time to say so. All right, you're good to go. Kathy.
Great. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of these. You all can see them. But we had 5 folks respond to our COVID bridge funding. We had 10 available, 5 folks responded. But we covered almost everything that we wanted to cover with these because one of these interns, Naha, has taken on 5 of the tasks that were available. So she's overachiever and she's doing great. We are super happy with the progress that all these folks have made. So we have somebody data mining our projects. We have somebody doing metrics for the management conference, doing cultural and tourism sites as an inventory. And then we've got somebody doing a 30th anniversary piece for us. Next year is our 30th anniversary. So she's doing a timeline and kind of going back to the old directors to find out what kinds of things they're proud of that happened under their watch. And then lastly, we have somebody working on Indian River Lagoon myths and mysteries.
Thank you.
So more to come on all of that.
Daniel?
All right, I'll try to go through this as quick as possible too. This is just kind of an update for the fiscal year as of quarter ending 6/30. We have 43 active projects in progress, 4 old small grants in progress, 6 new small grants under contract that just started, 5 COVID grants that Kathy just covered, and since the beginning of the fiscal year, 8 projects have finished, 5 of them alone in quarter 3. I'm just going to kind of go really fast each project, kind of the highlights for each one. So next slide. Indian River West County's West Wabasso septic to sewer completed in 2019. They were $68,219 on their budget. And the highlights was they connected all 101 parcels and are estimating to reduce 3,131 pounds of TN and 505 pounds of TP per year. Next slide. Dwayne kind of covered a little bit the Climate Ready Estuary project that finished in March of 2020. It was on budget, and you guys all know the highlights is that there was 9 adaptation actions over 3 vital signs. Just those alone would vastly improve the resiliency of the IRL to climate change stressors. Next slide. Brevard Zoos Restore Our Shores in 2018, 2019 finally wrapped up. They had some permit issues in eels, but finally got everything going. It finished in April 2020. It was on budget. Some of the highlights was over 3,600 plants were planted along almost 1,000 linear feet of shoreline. They had 800 linear feet of oyster reef installed and 3,145 volunteer hours. Next slide. UCF's finished their phase 2 of a shoreline suitability model for the North IRL. Some of you might recall phase 1 was mapping out that entire shoreline to see how much was natural shoreline or had been altered. So this was phase 2 where they're predicting a model of how much of that shoreline could have probability of mangrove persistence, and it was totally dependent on wave heights that they were seeing there. They were $127 under budget, and it was completed in May of 2020. Next slide. FDEP finished their aquatic preserve shoreline restoration in Brevard County in May 2020. They were $652 under budget. They had over 1,000 volunteer hours. 228 square meters of red mangroves were planted on BC Spoil Island 45, and over several spoil islands, over 1.5 acres of bird nesting habitat was created by removing Brazilian pepper and Australian pines. And they first started their horseshoe crabbing in this as well. Next slide. Brevard County finished their channel denitrification construction project. This was completed in June 2020. They were originally awarded $32,000. After reimbursement, they were $21,650 under budget. This project is still being monitored by the county for nutrient reduction potential. It was essentially a bioreactor construction using calcareous rock and charcoal briskets to help facilitate water quality improvements. Next. Hub SeaWorld wrapped up their project as well in June 2020. A lot of you remember the Mercury presentation from a meeting we had several quarters ago. They were finished on budget, and some of the highlights from that, besides the Mercury, was that they saw over time the nitrogen, what do you call it? Isotope, I'm sorry. Looks like it is being decreased over time from wastewater nitrogen. Next slide. And Bethune-Cookman with Reed Canal ended in December of 2019. I'm not sure the exact amount. I'm still awaiting some invoice backup on that, but it does look like it will be under budget by a few $1,000s. And they completely cleared, regraded, and planted multiple plants, as you can see in the before and after photos, for that stormwater park. And they also hosted a 6-day Protect Our Lagoon Academy at the BJ Moore Center in July of last year. And that's it.
Thank you. Dwayne?
I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can. You've got full presentations in your packages. And so for the last 2.5 years, we've been working, with the partners in transportation, both FDOT, St. John's has been involved, Florida Institute of Technology. Next slide, Kayleen, all related to 528 expansion from 4 to 6 lanes over Indian River Lagoon and Banana River. And if you recall back 2019, you all, as well as the council, passed a resolution, that requested that DOT and the partners, study and evaluate infrastructure improvements at 528 and 520, and encouraged the inclusion of any and all infrastructure improvements to benefit the lagoon. Next slide. So this is where we are, right now. The major issues on this has always been about, can we improve flow, and what does that mean, and also, are the levels that have been used in the original DOT plans adequate for vulnerability and resilience to sea level rise and storm surge? Next slide. So the work that Gary Zerillo did for us under a contract that was shared by both the National Estuary Program and IRL Council and Port Canaveral looked at different scenario plans. So here's the bottom line on that work. You know, making an improvement in expanding that opening on the bridge opening and reducing the causeway itself, the earthen causeway, not going to change anything if you just did 528. You have to do 528 and 520 in order to get some flow improvement. And Zerillo's work demonstrated, those models showed between a 9 and 17% flow improvement. And you can see that, you know, from the left to right feature. It is not insignificant, that amount of flow improvement. The question came, what does that mean as it relates to, you know, algal blooms and water quality? And so next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Gary also provided data from his work to FDOT on the sea level rise scenario. And the message really, and this is not just Dr. Zerillo, but others, you can't just look at, you know, mean sea level rise on a global scale. You got to look at local features. And for us, the biggest local feature is the seasonal high stands we have in fall. So you got to look at, you know, seasonal high stands, mean sea level rise, and if you've got the data, storm surge. And when you incorporate those three into consideration, then you can start to plan a resiliency of transportation and other infrastructure. So that's been provided to the, you know, the players and stakeholders in this decision. Next slide. Water Management District, thanks to the, you know, support of Dr. Ann Shortell, this is St. John's, said, you know, we'll use our hydrology model, kind of look and see how our results compare to Dr. Zerillo's, but also start to look at those water quality parameters like chlorophyll A, and looking at inputs like salinity, temperature, and nutrients. And so when that kind of model modification was applied both to the current condition and with 528 and 520 expanded, there was no significant, you know, predicted improvement in water quality based on chlorophyll A, which is not surprising when you think about it. It's a, you know, the system was always had a long resilience time, you know, gaining, you know, at maximum a 17% flow. It's still a microtidal system. You know, it's not a high flush system. But what was really interesting to me and shows the power of how this model is moving forward with the district is the next slide. The district team applied the same model and looked at the TMDL as well as a BMAP targets, and in fact showed significant kind of water quality improvements and reduction of chlorophyll A, which just supports once again the idea that if we want to improve water quality in the Banana River segment in particular, but throughout the lagoon, we're going to have to reduce nutrients at the source and begin to really, you know, look at stormwater, septic to sewer, including some of our, you know, our muck sites. Chuck, you want to jump in at all on that one with STEM, or are you good?
That's pretty good. I mean, again, what they tried to do was to take the chunk of the super bloom and take a look at what changing those loads might have done to that. It pushed it further back, it shortened it basically, and it also, I think, decreased the intensity. So this is just a month, June 2011, with and without that change in loads.
So next slide, Kayleen. And I'm going to combine kind of the end of this into like a single set of statements. So basically, DOT's at 60% PD&E, so they're at the line drawings of 60%. They want to move forward as designed. The issues at hand now, it's all about, you know, timing and cost, and which way do you go? And this is going to be a decision made by Space Coast, you know, Transportation and Planning, you know, organization, TPO, and which is really the cities, you know, and the county, partners. And so if they move forward as designed, the opportunity to increase flow, with causeway reduction basically goes away. So if you don't do 528, it doesn't make sense in doing 520. If in fact they go that route, then the burden of opportunity is going to be with the mitigation. How does DOT mitigate, and whether that mitigation is, adequate? Next slide. And so we all gave presentations, which you have in your package, the full presentations. So St. John's gave a full presentation, and I gave a full presentation, and then DOT gave a full presentation. The Technical Advisory Committee of Space Coast TPO, as well as a Citizen Advisory Committee, recommended just to move forward as designed. Don't consider a low elevation span bridge, and removal of causeway. When it got to the governing board, a number of questions came up, some really good technical questions about how do you kind of compare that flow improvement against the proposed mitigation. And because of these discussions, DOT shifted from traditional approach to looking at some of the projects within SORL, the Save Our Indian River Lagoon, to increase the nutrient load reductions, mainly from septic to sewer. And so they tabled the decision until September. We're providing this to you all as a bit of information. This is really TPO's decision now. And no matter where it goes, will determine kind of what our involvement might be going down the road. But the fact is, we've done our due diligence. We provided the best science that we can. I'm really excited about what the district did with their model, and you're going to see kind of a second part of this story here in a minute. But unless there's questions, stay tuned. They will meet again in September, and I suspect they'll make a decision in September about whether moving forward or maybe going back to a redesign. So with that, Chuck, I'm going to open for questions.
Okay, do we have any questions?
I
don't
see.
see. You do? Okay.
If anybody has individual questions after, take a look at those presentations, just call me or email me directly, and I'll handle any questions you might have.
Right now. Okay, the competitive grants. Sorry?
Is everybody awake out there?
Yeah, I think they're awake-ish.
Kayleen, you got to advance through a few of these.
Yep.
There we go.
Yep.
All right, I've heard from a number of you on the call still. We have an EPA competitive grants program that's being administered by Restore America's Estuaries in play as we speak. Every letter of intent has to have, because of this RFP, a letter from the NEP or a NEP that we acknowledge the existence of the grant letter of intent. Next slide. Did you go backwards or? There's a long history in this, but bottom line is August 7th, letters of intent are due. If anybody on the call is looking for a letter of intent, have not requested it yet, please let me know. I think I've done quite a few, and we'll see this in a minute. Full proposals are going to be due on November 7th. So there'll be an invitation among those LOIs for full proposals, and they'll be due November 7th. Next slide. So this is kind of what I'm anticipating from the lagoon. Kayleen, next slide, please. I've already done 10 letters of intent. I have at least 3 more kind of on the list. And these are coming from our partners, and some are within our boundaries, some are without it or outside of the boundary. So there's one coral reef project We are not partnering, so the NEP will not partner on any of these LOIs. We're limited to 3 total for the NEP, just like everybody else. And so we're going to take a little different approach to optimize the possibility of a grant coming to the lagoon. Next slide. The Association of National Estuary Programs is going to put in 3 proposals. One is base level monitoring on a national level. A second is standard methodology for economic valuation on a national level. And a third is an ag pilot program to look at how we might work with agriculture in the future, to look at nutrient reduction as well as food safety. We will not partner on either one of these either, although the second bullet, I'm actually the senior author for that LOI for IRLNEP. Next slide. But what we are moving forward, and we hope you agree, that we're going to put 2 LOIs in that are directly from the National Estuary Program and IRL Council. I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. The second one is to work with St. John's to take that model we just talked about that was used for 528 and take it to that next level. So make improvements, do QA, QC, expand the coverage of that model. So we begin to build a model that can help us kind of integrate the hydrology and water quality and using chlorophyll A and maybe in the future other pigments as predictors of biological response. And Chuck is working to put that together by the deadline. And the first one is an innovative technology project with a Maryland-based company, Storm Center Communications, who over the course of the last few years has developed with support from NOAA through the SBIR program, a very innovative communication. It's not a portal, it's not a data storage unit, it's a data communication application that has now been adopted by the National Weather Service, U.S. Census Bureau. It is available to federal government entities because it was federally funded through these LTIRs. And so it will be St. Johns River Water Management District, Storm Center, and the IRL Council to take this software and over 2 years demonstrate its value both as a way to share data among us within the network, water quality data, and also to use it as a training and planning tool for harmful algal bloom emergency response. And so to give you an idea, if we were all online now, if we had 5 of you with different data sets, you wouldn't have to bring your data sets in, that this software actually could integrate those data real time so we could have a conversation lagoon-wide, or very specialized without you actually having to transfer your data set to somebody else. It just means that the data has to be kind of in a similar format. So we're going to move these forward. And this one we did want to get, the odds of getting any of these funded, actually even invited for full proposal, is low. But we wanted to make sure that the Indian River Lagoon had really strong representation for this first year of federal funding to showcase the need, to showcase that they need to keep funding this competitive grants program at the feds. And then we'll move forward through this really quick turnaround to see who gets invited back for full proposals. So with that, Chuck, we just want to request support from the STEM AC on these 2 letters of intent, which are on, need to be submitted by August 7th.
So we're looking for a motion that would approve this approach to applying for the funds that are coming out of the Restore America's Estuaries group. May I have a, whoop.
So moved.
Thank you, Mitch. Second?
Okay.
Bob,
I didn't catch
Two.
that.
I seconded it.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Any discussion?
Chuck, just one more point from my end, if there's no discussion on this issue. Kayleen, are we good?
we're good?
Just want to also let you know, I think now we've got 3 confirmed applications going to the South Florida Regional Initiative, which was congressional funding for South Florida. The Indian River Lagoon a year ago was added to the South Florida Regional Initiative through EPA. So Indian River Lagoon proposals are possible through that new funding source. It was the South Florida Clean Water Act. If any of you are looking to put a proposal in on that, and those LOIs are due August 7th also, I am writing letters of support, for that South Florida initiative. So don't wait, please don't wait to the last minute. I'm getting them out literally same day, but want to make sure that we accommodate your needs if you're chasing proposals.
Okay, so we'll just go back and ask if there's anybody who opposes this action.
Oh, sorry, Chuck.
It's okay. All right, I think we're good.
Yep, I see no one.
Kayleen?
In your packets, we included the proposed 2021 meeting calendar. We kind of kept the same format as we had this year. It seemed to work very good. Our biggest question to you is, are you good with the fact that you're going at 1:30 in the afternoon? And of course, if there's any major conflicts that I might have missed. We don't need a motion or anything. It's kind of just out there.
Okay. So does anybody have major heartburn with going in the afternoon on the Tuesdays every quarter?
Everybody's shaking their heads no that I can see, but we only got like 3 cameras on, so.
I think we're okay. If you do, let us know.
Oh, 4, sorry, Bob was out of camera view.
Okay. All right. Okay. Dwayne.
All right, really quickly, while we were meeting, St. Johns River Water Management District just released their RFP for $25 million in funding for the Indian River Lagoon. We'll distribute that to everybody to make sure you're aware of it. This is a lagoon-wide effort that was made possible because of legislative funding during the last session. So $25 million of new money is on the street for lagoon projects, and we hope you all aggressively chase dollars with projects. Second point, we are deep in federal reauthorization. I won't bore you with the details, but we have a very complicated policy and political play moving right now. And in fact, it may even happen this week. We have been inserted in the WERDA bill, the Everglades WERDA bill, and we may actually see some movement before the end of the week. And we'll just keep everybody posted, on that issue. We still are watching COVID stimulus very carefully. There's a chance there could be water infrastructure money there, and we're working with Congress at multiple levels. The big news is that we very well may see language in WERDA that will add a new national estuary program to the mix in Florida, and it would be Perdido Pensacola Bays. A letter has been sent from DEP and the governor to our 2 senators to amend language as appropriate to get that process moving. And then lastly is just a heads up, Carolyn Ansay, who you've all met before, our attorney and general counsel with Torsivia, has now joined the ranks as the new general counsel for South Florida Water Management District. She'll start that job in a few weeks. This will be her last meeting to council. She's been an amazing legal counsel for us. I'm going to hate to see her go, but all of you who have had an opportunity to interact, I kind of urge you to just reach out by email or a phone call, you know, wish her well, thank her for her hard work, and we'll be doing something formally for her and the council, you know, once we get out of this COVID isolation mode we're in. And with that, that's all I have, Chuck. I think we got close to almost 2 minutes over time, so we got close.
Okay. So, any final comments for the good of the order?
It looks like we owe Chuck a birthday cake when COVID's done.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, happy birthday, Chuck.
Thank
we
you.
didn't know.
Happy birthday.
The heck of a way to spend a birthday.
That's okay. It was good fun. I've had lots of them, so.
Yeah, next round of beers will be on me.
All right. If nothing else, I thank you all for your time and patience. And be safe and be sane.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Be safe. And
I have one question, maybe just between Dwayne and I. Dwayne, how much, if we increase the flow in the lagoon between 6 and 9%, how meaningful is that? Do we know that yet?
no, we don't. And that's the challenge, is that, you know, it's possible that we could apply the St. Johns River Water Management District model to kind of look at what that chlorophyll A prediction would be, you know, with changed hydrology and flow. So that's kind of what this project would do, is take it to that next level. But in the DOT or in the TPO meeting, that was the question that was asked. I think that's why it got tabled. So Commissioner Brian Lober asked a very essential question, and he said, how do we compare X number of septic to sewers and, you know, the poundage of nitrogen and phosphorus removed, you know, which alone isn't going to change the dynamic, because it's not enough load reduction, to this 9 to 17%. So your question is absolutely the question that makes it tough for them to make a decision. As long as we're having this conversation and we're adjourned, I basically go online. You can
wait, please. We're
well, so Mitch, if you go online, they've got that entire meeting now on the TPO website, and you can see the presentations. You know, I was asked to make a personal professional statement, which I did. And you know, if anybody's got questions about kind of the more of the detail, just give me a call.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Hey, Dwayne. Dwayne, you mentioned the 25 million through St. John's. Is that going to be applied to the whole lagoon or just in St. John's district?
No, whole lagoon. So they've been coordinating with South Florida Water Management District. You know, I haven't seen the RFP, but my guess, even though money and contracts will come through St. John's, I believe that it'll be a review team. Chuck, you may know how this, you know, is going to actually work, but it's whole lagoon. So it was, you know, in fact, they actually used the watershed, the CCMP, as the watershed boundary for this RFP. So it even includes our boundary extension on the northern end of Volusia County. So a really, you know, spectacular kind of increase in funding, considering.
So are there proposals coming forward to it or working on them?
The RFP just hit the street literally about 2 hours ago.
Yeah, the deadline is the 17th of August, or the 21st of August, sorry. And hang on one tick.
And Chuck, I believe there's no match.
No, that's I think there's a range. I haven't got into the details, but they tried to lower the match a bit. So typical cost share for the district had a 50-50, and so they wanted to spread the ability out across groups that couldn't reach that. So that's probably a lower match, maybe in the 30 range or something like that. Jody Hutchins is the South Florida person that's on this email. So she's the one to maybe talk with if you want to talk with someone from there.
So, yeah.
I'll
so
have
that's in this-
Kayleen distribute that RFP to everybody through our
Appreciate it.
network.
Thanks.
When I read it says 100% up to, but consideration will be in the evaluation for match.
Yeah. I mean, so yes. So typically for the regular cost share, you know, people that came in at about 50-50, you know, because they run out of money relatively quickly, would, you know, kind of get over the hump. And people who came in and said we need it all would struggle. So, but yeah, but I think they're, you know,
So
again,
proposals are due, or you said in mid-August or sometime?
21st, I believe. Yep.
Okay, 21st. And then when does the project start, or when can you start?
No later than July 31st, 2021. And you got 2 years.
Yep. I mean, they're trying to move this fast. So, I mean, the official go only came probably no more than 10 days ago. So they went from nothing to, you know, having this on the street as fast as they could.
If you could send that around, appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll get Kayleen to send it out to everybody directly through our normal channels.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe out there.
So long.
Toodaloo.
Hi guys, thanks a lot.